So I am moderating this luncheon session, and just a couple of household items I have to go through. Please sit in a seat, not in the aisles, or stand near the doors. Don't forget that there are bathrooms through that door, the men's room through that door, which we want to make sure we use all the time. And please put your lunches under your seats, because we're going to go from this session at 2 o'clock right into the next session, and then there'll be a long coffee break, and everything will get cleaned out at that time. So rather than get up with your lunch, please put it under your seat. So this session is about what it feels like to be in a minority. There's not probably a person, certainly not a woman in this room, who has not been in a department, a section, a meeting, a committee, where she felt like she was in the minority by way of gender, color, sexual preference, whatever, and for that reason maybe not heard or not seen. And so what does one do in that situation? And we have some women here who exemplify that by way of being in the departments they were in early on, when there were very few women, as well as by way of their sexual orientation and by way of color. And they're going to talk about strategies. They're only going to talk about what they have learned for like 5 minutes. And then the entire rest of the session is Q&A. So you see the ushers on both sides with index cards. The whole thing is supposed to be mostly your questions to these women. So please take advantage of the index cards. Write your questions starting now. Keep writing. Bring them up to me, and they will address it after they go through their initial little summary. The first person I want to introduce you to, although many of us don't need any introduction to her, is Dr. Barbara Kinder. She was a Yale alum in the class of... To know Barbara is to love her. She was in the class of 71 at the school. She was on the faculty from 1977 to 04. When she went to medical school, she was 9 of 100. Very, very different now. She was only one of 2 women who finished surgical residency when she finished it. She started the nascent area of endocrine surgery and eventually became the chief of endocrine surgery. She's had numerous awards, including most recently being awarded Distinguished Member by the Association of Women Surgeons. Barbara, your 5 minutes of what you have learned.
Thank you, Peggy. You gave half my talk there. Yeah, as you heard, I was, I'm a 1971 graduate of Yale Medical School. There were 9 women in my class, but interestingly, 3 women finished surgical residencies and actually practiced as surgeons. So, lest we think that we solved all the problems, you know, they're really, that's an anomaly nationally. I attribute that number of women going into surgery to the very supportive activities of a few male faculty who really convinced us that surgery was possible for women to do and that women should be involved in it. So, I'm grateful for that. Nationally, as I said, this was far from the norm. In the early 70s, several women colleagues and I decided to start a women's breakfast at the American College of Surgeons, our annual meeting. In the first meeting, we couldn't even fill an 8-seat table, and now we fill, you know, a whole hotel ballroom. So that's fantastic. And related to that, I'd like the women in surgery who trained at Yale or are Yale affiliated to stand. I know you're in the back row there. I saw a bunch of you. So there are quite a few. And also our wonderful new chairman, Nita Ahuja, who was here. We're so glad that she's here. It truly is a new era. So much has changed, but much really remains to be done. And although I think the legislative issues that Naomi talked about are necessary things for us to change, they're certainly not sufficient. And what is going to make the difference is really mentoring. And that's sort of what I'm going to talk about mostly. That's been a very important part of my professional life, mentoring, and it continues even in retirement. I was proud this, a week or so ago to march with the Yale faculty when one of my proteges graduated and carried the flag for the medical school, Kate Buser. I have two other young women who are entering medical school as first-year students. So this is something that mentoring is something that you do all your life. So I've thought about mentoring quite a lot over the years and have sort of reflected on, what the issues are and how we can best approach being better mentors. I think the historical context in which we're mentoring is very important. I remember a conversation that Ann Curtis and I had when I was a medical student, and I was sort of saying, geez, it's pretty nice here. Everybody seems nice, and they're not, picking on me or anything. And Ann said, and I believe this absolutely to be the case, she said, it's because we are so few. And so we're sort of tolerated. In a way, we're kind of pets. But when it gets to be, when the successful minority gets to be close to a majority, then you begin to see some pushback. I think we can see this in politics. I wonder whether, as I was listening to Joan talk, whether some of this subtle pushback is part of what causes the unease. In other words, people who might be somewhat threatened by more women coming in or more minorities or whatever will, on the surface, accept that we're there and we're glad to see us, but subversively or underground, they may be pushing back, maybe not even being aware of it because of implicit bias. So that they're subverting our progress towards our goal of having equitable opportunities for all minorities. And I wonder whether there's some of that behind the scenes kind of low emotional rumble is something that we women, since we're pretty good at picking up those vibes, are kind of sensing that add to our sense of anxiety. So as we try to be mentors in a current era, we have to be aware of the fact that what people are experiencing now is completely different from what I experienced, in the early days when there really were very few women. So we have to be very alert to the explicit and implicit bias in society, and also, and maybe even most particularly in our own lives, in the way we think about things, and try to figure out strategies to work around those issues. The other thing I want to say is that I think that mentorship is a very complicated process. And I know that when I was in medical school, you were assigned an advisor. And I'm not sure I ever met with the advisor, probably my fault, not the advisor's, but it's not enough just to have a structure. This is a contract that needs to be developed in concert between the mentor and the protege. And it's got to have very specific goals and aspirations, verifiable results. And so it demands a lot from the student and the faculty person. On the other hand, informally every day, there are wonderful opportunities to be a mentor. When you see somebody that's struggling, a word of comfort, a little support, an offer to follow up on something, makes all the difference in the world. And I think that these sensitivities are things that women do extremely well, and we're well positioned to continue to be good mentors.
Thank you, Barbara. Again, we're going to have 5 minutes from each woman and then questions and answers from the audiences. So, ushers, I hope that you're walking up and down the aisles collecting questions, if there are any, with the index cards. Thank you. The next wonderful woman we're going to hear from is Dr. Laura Mammalides. Again, many people know her, probably doesn't need any introduction. She's a professor of surgery and the section chief of neuropathology. She's also a Yale alum from the class of '67. She's been an active scientist her whole life, studying DNA repeats and slow viral agents. She's served on multiple committees nationally, etc., and she's been an outspoken woman's advocate since almost before she was born. And so, Laura, what have you learned as strategies for coping with being a minority, which you certainly were when you joined?
So I think it's best to talk a little bit about the vignettes of where I come from and what I met in Yale Medical School in that antediluvian time which was 1963. And 1963 was just the beginning of, Vietnam wasn't really there yet. Civil rights were not really there yet. Of course, it was for me because I'm a New Yorker and I have certain ties. And feminism wasn't there yet, except I had a mom who was very successful, very understated, very diplomatic, who reminds me, can you not be diplomatic? Instead of just being so outspoken, I said, no, Mom, because I think this is a time when you have to say what is true and you have to pursue excellence. And I think I went to a women's school, and in some ways that school, it was an artsy craftsy school. It had a very different structure than most of what males are and what male structures are. And because they really didn't have any competition. And Yale Medical School has the same structure in certain ways in its educational system from Winternitz. Students are allowed to find their own way in the Yale system. They don't have to have a pecking order that is one beats someone else. One has to be in competition. And what I learned at Sarah Lawrence, and I think everybody that I was with, and I have some famous classmates who are wonderful dancers like Meredith Monk and et cetera, others who are famous lawyers, is that pursuing what you really love and really going after what you really love, and it may not always be the same thing, is the best way to protect yourself from the bows and arrows. Okay, so I came to Yale. I actually was majored in English literature. I wanted to be a poet. My brother said to me, I don't see any want ads in the New York Times for poets. So I said, well, maybe I'll go to medical school. I'm sort of interested in it. I'm sorry.
No, somebody's phone went off.
Maybe I'll go to medical school. And so on a sort of whim, I liked science, and I'd worked in mental hospitals and was very interested in the brain, and what was thought. And I wasn't really satisfied with a lot of the philosophical and psychiatric things at the time, and I said, I want to find out about the brain. So I came and I interviewed, and at Harvard, where my brother was, all they asked me, first a woman asked me, she told me, well, you know, if you go to Harvard, if you go to medical school, you know you can't have children, you can't have a family, you can't do this, etc. Then I waited for another 2 hours to see the second interviewer, and I walked in, and he's sitting in this enormous office with a big rug, and he's sipping grapefruit juice. And he sort of lectured at me for a while, and then he said, you know, who are you going out with tonight? Where are you staying? And then I would say, I'm staying with my brother. I came up for the interview, and then he would ask me 5 minutes later the exact same question, and then again the same question. And then he took me to see some films, and everybody, it was very patriarchal. We know this and we know that. They all lined up for him. And he said, well, do you have any questions about Harvard? And I said, yes. I said, when are you going to socialize hospital care so people like my friends whose parents were in the Holocaust and have no money and are musicians and can't take care of themselves and be taken care of? At which point, I realized I was not going to get into Harvard, where I didn't want to go. Anyhow, and unlike Harvard, I mean, other places were similar, but unlike Harvard, when I came, I was interviewed by somebody named Dean Forbes, and he was the dean of students. And he said, well, you know, we have a very open system, and I had done some work on Benjamin Rush, and I liked history of medicine, and again, I was interested in some of the background of psychiatry. And he said, you can do anything here. This is the Yale system. We let people develop on their own. So, of course, when I came in, I was a total loser. We had a wonderful lecturer named Harberry, and the idea when he was talking about ATP and et cetera, I thought the whole point of the Krebs cycle was to make water and carbon dioxide. That's what kept coming off. You know, what did I know about this stuff? So I went with my friends and played tennis. They knew this stuff because they'd been at Yale. And I was a loser, but I noticed that the boys had a pecking order. There was a hierarchy. Since I was such a crummy student, they were really nice to me. But as time went in, what I realized that the structure is very different. It's a pyramid. And we had a very small bureaucracy when I came. There were 3 deans. One was Vernon Lepard. The first day of medical school, I walked in with 4 other women. We got lost, and we were in a minute late. He said, oh, there come all the women. We waste all of our money because all they're going to do is go and have babies and get married and drop out, and it's a waste of our money. So, I mean, this is true. And then he went on to go on about that for 5 minutes. So I was also interested in the history of medicine, just to mention a few vignettes of what it was like. And I was on the Journal of the History of Medicine, and we did a lot of things. And I was not invited to the Nathan Smith Club because they didn't have women in. So I wrote to Vernon Lepard, and I said, my little 18th century style note, well, is my intellect diaphanous? And these are the little things. And so he called me and he said, I wanted to see who wrote this wonderful letter. I said, well, I suppose now I'm going to be invited. And he just looked at me, he said, you can leave now. And a few years later, he saw me in the lunchroom when I was an instructor, and he said, oh yeah, you were one of those early feminists. And I think that unlike you, this is what I would like to say to you. If you pursue excellence and what you love, I didn't know I liked science. I really love science, and science was creative. And, you know, it was something you could try things, you could experiment, you could fail, and you could go back and do something else. And when you do clinical diagnosis, you realize you have a patient. And I was in this wonderful place where I saw a lot of medicine and a lot of self-critical thinking and a lot of openness and discussion. And sometimes I think the bureaucracy is getting more and more medieval, and it's getting, you know, people have less freedom. There's less support for people trying to follow their own way. And I always try to encourage people, find what you really love. You can always change it if you don't like it. And be generous to people and be as excellent as you can in any way you can.
Thank you, Laura. Thank you. And now the next person that we're going to hear from is a Dr. Susan Higgins. She's a professor of therapeutic radiology and OBGYN, and she's the associate program director for the residency program in therapeutic radiology. She's been at Yale since 1996, and she is noted for excellence in clinical work and research, especially in women's cancer, treating women with cancer, especially breast and ovarian cancer. She's been openly gay for a long time. She's been very active in the gay community. She's been very helpful in helping me teach medical students about what it means to be in a minority group because of sexual orientation, and she's going to talk about what she has learned being at a minority at Yale, where many people on the faculty, let alone students are much more open than on the faculty, still do not come out because they don't feel like they will be accepted if they're GLBT. We have a long way to go in this area. Sue, what have you learned?
I've learned, so I wanted to start a little bit in a circuitous path because something came up while we were, I was talking to one of the medical students, and I wanted to thank you for having the medical students as part of this event. Because one of the things, so I'll just go back to those sessions that we had with the students, and one of the issues that came up there was that they could not get gay people. There really were few women who would really get up at the podium and say, okay, I'm going to do this session. I remember you saying that it was very hard to find people, and of course I had kind of come up to the point in my life where I was able to do that. But one of the themes that I brought up in that particular talk, and I don't know if you remember this, but I started out talking about how it feels to be any minority, and it brings me back to the Sesame Street song.
I remember that.
Which one of these things is not like the other? You know, if you hear that song and think it's about you, then you're a minority. You know, and what comes from that, the second one is which one of these things doesn't belong, right? So from a very young age, children are even able to recognize these things. This is not something that is new to us, but it becomes clearer to us as we go along. And one of the conversations we had here with one of the students is that, you know, I had kind of many layers of being not like the other, and some people don't know the very, very beginning of my story, but it brought to mind what some of the first-generation immigrant families are facing is that my first challenge was to be what I would call myself a sort of a person of limited resources. And that's something no one's really addressed, which is if you come from limited resources, you're not even thinking about the degree. You're thinking, how the heck am I going to get through school? So, you know, I came from an immigrant family where their like basic story was life is hard, you're on your own. So literally when I went to school, they were like, you're on your own. I remember sitting down the other morning at morning rounds, and we were talking about, okay, we got to deal with this, we got to deal with Epic, we got to do our notes, and we're all kind of crabby about everything that's going to happen. And I don't know where it came from, but I sat there and said, well, 40 years ago, I was packing lamps into a box in a factory, so whatever happens today can't be that bad. And that's true. My first job was in a lamp factory. It was like 100 degrees, and you'd go home, and you'd be sweating and dying, but that was what I started at. I lived in a factory town. So I took every single job, because again, my parents were like, go find some money. I took every single job that I could get, and that included, in no particular order, keeping the salad bar at Wendy's, selling vacuum cleaners door to door. I was the front desk person at the YMCA. I did landscaping, and I also sold Amway. So anything that I had to do every single summer, I did work study during college. But that was my first stress. I mean, I really didn't know if I was going to get through school. So I think that that's a real stressor to people who come from that background, and I think the first generation students are facing it, and if you can't get past that hurdle, you're not going anywhere. And I think that I was in a private college, in a private medical school. I went to the University of Rochester, undergrad and graduate. There weren't that many people who were in that exact circumstance, I have to say. I did a lot more work study than most kids. And I even worked 2 jobs during medical school, catering and things like that. So that was the first thing of not feeling sort of like the other. And if you're not socializing because you're working all the time, you're not networking. And that kind of carried through to medical school. But I think I really realized in medical school that what happened then was the next layer was I don't really associate with people because I don't know any other gay students, and I'm in the closet. So that networking that's supposed to happen at that point didn't happen. And a lot of people experience this due to their gender, their sexuality, whatever it is. But it's very, 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 it's a huge limitation. If you feel like you can't blend in and you can't find a peer group, right there, I think, sort of your professional growth starts to become stunted. I was lucky, though, when I got to the point of, I think, joining the faculty, that I had then gotten a little more confidence, and I knew a lot of, I could say this, but I knew a lot of guy things. I knew a lot of guys, and I knew a lot of guy things, and I like sports, and I like cars. And Susan's smiling, because if you were in our department back then, and you knew something about cars, that was pretty good. That was a good thing. Anne's laughing. She knows why I'm saying this. And I used to gap my own spark plugs, like back in the day, so I could talk about that. And that was a big in, because Jim Fisher, who was our chair at that time, I mean, what we did at lunchtime, we would sit and we would talk about cars. And he collected cars, and I knew cars, and he knew cars, so I thought that was good. Okay, so my thing was blending in. I mean, that was really my strategy. That was my strategy. I'm like, you know what? I think I could do this dance. I can kind of talk about a lot of things. I love baseball. I was the only girl in my high school that read Baseball Digest on a regular basis. I was the only woman in Guilford who got tire rack and went front to back cover. So I really was starting to get my footing there. And then I think for the people in the gay community, I found that first being a person and knowing people as a person, having the confidence for that, and then bringing yourself to them as a gay person, setting that context took many years. But I was able to kind of I was in a very good place, though. I had a lot of colleagues and my chair I really wasn't afraid I would get rejected. It was more my own self-confidence.
Okay. Thank you, Sue.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. And now the next person that we're going to hear from is Dr. Cindy Christo. She's an associate professor of psychiatry. She's an assistant chair for diversity and in the Department of Psychiatry. She's recognized for leadership in bringing diversity into culture, both in her department, in our school, and in the community. This is what she's very special at, and she is a woman of color, and she is going to talk about what is the most minority, which is a woman of color, especially in this school. Cindy.
So thank you everyone for being here. I think it's phenomenal that we actually get to hear from a woman of color today. We don't often get the opportunity within our institution, so I really appreciate the opportunity. So as a black woman at Yale School of Medicine and at this institution, I think the main thing for me is how do we work within a system that was not necessarily designed for us, for you, or with your interests in mind. And we had a wonderful session this morning that really talks about the historical legacy of Yale and other similar institutions. And I just really mean the legacy of that. It's kind of what has transpired and continues to keep those systems going, where you feel like a system was not necessarily designed for you. So depending on your role in the institution, you could lay claim to that statement. You could say that the institution is not designed for clinicians, it's not designed to support community-based research, it's not designed to support whatever you might do. And you might lay claim to that. So to be clear, I think we all must work tremendously hard in this system to be successful. But I think for some of us, just by virtue of our social position and identity status, you have an easier time negotiating and navigating the system to make it work for you. So that just means based upon your gender, your race, your ability status, you can more easily access information. You have access to mentors, advocates, and champions. That is, if you ask for what you want, you get it. And I know Mary talked a lot about that this morning. I don't always think that's the case for women of color, that when you ask for what you want, that you get it. And I think for some people, there's just an inherent value in the type of work that you do. But as a woman of color, I think you have to constantly work hard to navigate and negotiate this values-based system and to make it work for you. I know for sure that if you don't have people to support you, you cannot make it in this system. You cannot succeed. We experience racism, both overt and covert. We experience prejudice, microaggressions, micro-insults, where the victims are casualties of other people's blind spots, meaning that you just tend to help people who look like you, and there's lots of research on this now. We don't see images of ourselves at the institution. This includes portraits on the walls, in meetings, in senior leadership, and certainly not the upper levels of academic tracks. So I can't speak for all black women, but I know from my own research and that of others, the accumulation of these experiences wears you down. They take a toll. They make you tired. They make you irritable. They make you sick. The stress associated with can make changes to your DNA. It makes you question whether or not you should stay at this institution. But I can speak to what these experiences mean for me, and that really means that at no point, not one moment, do I not think about being a black woman in this space. It's ever present, it never goes away, except for maybe when I reach flow, that point where you're really engrossed in something and you kind of tune everything out. But other than that, it's really a sense that, you're different in this environment. So when I step into a room, into a meeting, I'm fully conscious and aware of the fact that I'm a black woman, and I know that other people know that as well. And at some level, I wonder what they're thinking. At some level, I can say that I'm never fully comfortable in my skin. I experience the imposter syndrome. I probably experience stereotype threat, which people have talked about earlier today at some level, and just the uncomfortable feeling of maybe just being in a space that wasn't necessarily created for you. So how do I deal with this? So despite these experiences, I have three primary things that really have helped me to navigate and negotiate this system. I've had phenomenal mentors, and I know for sure without them I would not be here. So starting from the very beginning, Nadia Ward, Joy Kaufman, who are faculty members in my department and where I am at the Consultation Center. When you first start out here, people have to put you on their grants and help support you. You don't have a mechanism necessarily to do that, and they did that for me. They fought for me in terms of equity, in terms of my title, in terms of my salary, all those kinds of things. And from there, I've just been able to develop other mentoring relationships with lots of other people here in the institution. My work is valued. I address issues of culture, diversity, and equity and social justice in my institution where I am, the Consultation Center, that's at the foundation of what we do. Many times women of color, especially if you study things like health disparities, it's not necessarily valued, and you don't have the support, you don't have the collaborators to actually engage in that work. And then I have a community of support here. So I have my agency where I am, the Consultation Center. I have MORE, the Minority Organization for Retention and Expansion, which is an oasis for me, and I know for other people. And the same with swim. I leave swim meetings and I'm fired up and I'm ready to go, and I know I can do this. So those types of organizations are extremely important and have been critical for me in my ability to sustain what I do here and my progression here.
Thank you, Cindy. Thank you. And now in the next 20 minutes, we're going to take your questions. And this is, wow, really coming at. We have 4 questions about the makeup of this panel with some indignance. I'll read them to you. How can you have a panel about underrepresented minorities and have only 1 black woman and no Asian woman? I'll read you another one. Can you address why you did not or chose not to include more women of color on your panel as minority women? Is the social breakdown of this panel an accurate representation of the YSM faculty or student body? Another one. In 2018, how can Yale Medical School have an open panel of underrepresented minorities that does not have 4 women of color? And then Christo, how do you react to being asked to being on a committee of diversity with minorities? Do you love it or do you get resentful? So before you address that, I want you to know that we did put a lot of thought into this panel, and there was a feeling that, yes, almost 50% of the faculty is now women, and clearly more than 50% of the medical school is women, but women still do not have leadership positions. Women still do not have control over the many things that they would like to have control over, and the world that we train in and the world that we work in is still very, very dominated by male values. And that's why we thought hearing from women who were minority when they started and are still in the minority with regards to leadership now would be an okay thing to do, even though we know women of color and women of a minority sexual orientation are much more in the minority than are women of color. So I just wanted to defend the representation of the panel, although the sentiment is well taken, and thank you for your comments. So Christo, are you resentful or do you love the minority of being the spokesperson for the black woman?
It's a blessing and a curse. I think, again, to be able to hear the voice of, even if it's one woman of color, I think is important. Again, we don't have the opportunity to have these conversations. We know a lot about the experiences of women in general. We have high-profile cases, we have lots of information, but in terms of women of color, we don't have a lot of information, we don't have the dialogue. So in that regard, I appreciate being here. The flip side is, you know, one person's experience does not represent, obviously, everyone's experience. So it is important to have more voices, it is important to have more conversations, and so it's a blessing and a curse to sort of sit here today.
Thank you. All right. I want to read another one because this was my era. It's about the term sexual preference, which I probably said by mistake, has been used today. The recommended terminology is sexual orientation, as it better reflects the lack of choice of GLBTQ individuals have in regarding to who they are attracted to. So I apologize if I used the wrong word. That's what I used to say. It's not the right way of saying it anymore. Do you want to say anything more about that? I mean, because people say a lot of different things, right?
A
Yeah.
lot.
No, I'm not defending myself. Go ahead.
But you know, I think you know, I didn't get to basically go very far into the. I was glad that we talked about the stereotype issue because for many people that is one of the things that's a real wedge between them and their colleagues, and it's a real fear. So I think the terminology is secondary to the actual, you know, just the whole concept of being gay and not being by the, being like the rest. I don't know that I care as much about the term as how people treat me.
Yeah, Laura.
There are lots of ways of making decisions about how you live. And in our laboratory, we were known, one of the greatest things that I had is somebody who was gay, who couldn't get a job anywhere else and was dropping out of biology school, biology graduate school, came, and I said, I was just lucky enough to get in. And he said, hey, there are these things you might like called restriction enzymes. And that began my life. And we have always had a lab that we've tried to hire people who were Vietnam vets, even though it was highly risky. We've had a lot of people in our lab who are gay. We've had people who are from all different countries, and I think this is what makes our lab great. It sometimes makes it more difficult. And I've taken grief when I had somebody from Syria, and I said, yeah, of course you can use our conference room to pray, every 4 hours or whatever it is. And other people were making nasty comments, and I said, not in my lab. I said, you don't work here. So I think there are I think diversity is diversity of ideas and inclusion and unity. And I really don't like to see the kind of thing where it's this or that on this side, on the other side. And I think this is the way one loses the power of what is really the ethical or the high-value way of being.
Okay, thank you. Barbara.
I think for all of us, the tension has been, whatever minority we represent, in my case, a woman in surgery, the tension is always between following your dream and doing the best you can to keep your eye on the ball and being able, and at least getting to the place and having the courage to speak out against inequities as you find them. And that's why I think the mentorship is so important. We just need to bring more people in with those sensibilities and that courage so that everybody can come along. It can't be about the success of 5, 10, 100, 1,000 of it. It's got to be about everybody's success.
Okay. Now there are two questions about how can you be outspoken without being afraid of retaliation. One says, how do I get what I deserve? In my lab, I am not able to openly talk with my PI. What all I do this for is for the labs, including grants, manuscripts. My PI is a very, very busy person, fails to see it. Also, my earlier experience talking openly to him has not come to anything. Also, there is a communication gap. He is not good at with female colleagues. Wow, it sounds like there's a real problem in communication. I don't know if we're going to answer this in one. But what would you do if you were a woman or underrepresented minority in a lab where the person with all the power is not paying attention to you and you can't talk up? And I guess you're afraid to talk up because of retaliation. And the same kind of question, what is your advice for a very outspoken young woman who wants to succeed in academic medicine? It seems impossible to build a great career without biting your tongue and, quote unquote, playing the game. It is also very difficult to find mentors. Barbara, you want to start?
It obviously is a problem. I think one thing is that when you're looking at whether you're an educational institution, undergraduate, graduate, postdoctoral, you really need to do some research as to what the climate is like there. It's all hard work. Science is hard work. Medicine's hard work. You need to be sure that you're in the place that, to the best of your ability, is going to be a nurturing place. And obviously, Yale is a place that, for many of us has been that kind of a place. So I think you need to be, careful to try and put yourself in a place where you can thrive and not just endure.
I was just going to add, I was just going to add that we've started a mentoring program, and I have 2 women that, junior faculty that I'm working with in our department, I think is going to really benefit from this because I think they need, we kind of a lot of it's just a pep talk. Really, it's knowing what they want and really kind of giving them the pep talk. And I give the pep talk I'm like, if I worked in a factory and I did that, you can do it too. And if I spoke up and I was the first one, you can do it too. I think I was the first person in my department to become a full professor, so I felt like that was a really important thing because our department started with Mort Kligerman in 1958. So it was 2013 when I was promoted to full professor. That's 55 years. So I think somebody, you know, the clinicians, not the basic science side, I'm sorry about that, but in the clinical track for us, it was all men. And it's almost 60 years now, and we have now 2, 3, 4 maybe clinical faculty members that are women. I think 4.
One really brief comment, and that is that your mentors may not be in the institution, they may not be in your department. You know, like Juanita, I was mentored by Jim Jameson and Fred Gorlick in cell biology in the field I was working in. And most of the places that I got sort of nationally were because of national mentors in other institutions, you know, who can answer your specific needs. So don't forget to look outside of the institution as well.
And I would also say there may be other people within your department. So in my role as assistant chair for diversity, that might be a way to go. Or to Darren Lattimore, that might be a way to go. Are there other people in the department that you can go to talk about whatever the issue, the struggle is, and to decide on a course of action? And maybe that's bringing them in at some level. So depending on the nature, there just may be other people, other resources within your department to help with that.
This is a question anybody wants to take. Let's talk about intersectionality. There is a pecking order among women, and women of color often have to wait for white women to break down the glass ceiling first, and then can white women advocate for their colleagues who are women of color? Are there analogies to inclusion? I can't read the rest of it in medicine. Cindy, do you want to take that? Pecking order amongst women?
I think that, again, the voices of women of color generally are left out of committees, conversations, and I think the degree to which we all can recognize that and fix it, I think that's going to be important. There was a task force on gender equity several years ago. And to my knowledge, no women of color on that task force, and that's just a major problem. And I think we just have to recognize that and do better.
Anybody else want to say anything? In clinical medicine or biomedical research, both worlds seem increasingly competitive to all trainees. How do you encourage and incentivize support of women and/or underrepresented minorities among persons who may see themselves to be in their direct competition? So encouraging inclusiveness rather than competitiveness, and the only way you can achieve is by putting someone else down. What?
At the same level, people at the same level.
Well, in a lab, or I guess it could be in clinical medicine too, on a team.
Well, it seems to me it's a responsibility of the PI or the chairman or the dean to make that the culture of the program. And if that's not there, then that's a failure of leadership. So it doesn't matter at what level, but that's just really, really important. Nobody can thrive in an inimical atmosphere.
Okay. There was a climate survey done by the dean recently, and there was a lot that was addressed with regards to climate and with regards to competitiveness and what the values were. And I would like to see medicine evolve into one where there's much more inclusiveness. A lot more could get done. A lot more could get done in the lab, in clinical medicine, in the world. This is another one about race. Black women residents have told me that the worst offenses come from the faculty. How do we address this? It is outrageous.
So in my role as assistant chair for diversity in the Department of Psychiatry, these things come to me now as well as other people. And so just really doing some level of investigation, understanding what the nature of the issue is, what does the person want to have done about it, if anything, providing them support, but also giving that feedback back to the faculty person, from their direct supervisor, from me, from Darren Lattimore, from someone, that they actually get the feedback, and that's monitored, and that's, continued to be addressed. Whether or not that's part of, review processes, promotion processes, I think we're sort of starting to really grapple with that, what it means in my department, but it's certainly something we're struggling with and trying to really address these things as they come up. So again, if it's something that you're experiencing, there are mechanisms and ways to be able to deal with it.
Okay, thank you. Another question, this pushback you get as a woman, I hadn't really experienced it until I became a professor, but now I feel it, now that I'm in charge. I admit that I struggle with this realization, and it's to the imposter syndrome that I definitely have. Any words of wisdom? Well, Sue, you have to answer this, or Laura, because you're the professors here.
A sense of humor.
And I would just say, oh, sorry, like, again, I try to find common ground. I try to be a consensus builder and find things that we have in common as human beings, as academic physicians, academic scholars, and go from there.
Yeah, I think you can also, you don't have to be all by yourself. I mean, there are other colleagues of a same mind that you can sort of ally yourself with and, resist the pushback a little bit, get some allies. There are always people I think you can work with to make that right
I
away.
think, one of the great differences now, before is before there were so few of us, and we all had to act independently. We went and did our things that we thought was right, and sometimes other people would think we're fools for doing that. But I think now you have so many more women, if you organize and if you put your mind together about common values and what is really fair, I think you have a much better shot at really changing things. And I don't mean just talk, I mean to change certain things in the system, certain structures, certain kinds of actions that have to be taken.
But I do think there's a reality to it where you have to proceed cautiously, because if you push too hard, the door gets shut. I think that's true for some of us. We feel like the doors have been shut in certain places where I think if you're not strategic enough, I think that's the problem.
I think these are choices one makes.
Right.
I mean, I made my choices, and again, one of the things that helps me is having tenure, which I think very few women have. And, I think that this is a really important thing, and I do agree. Organizing, I was helped in some of my worst moments with men who had no reason to help me. I wasn't doing anything for them. They just said, "This is wrong. What's happening to you?" And I mean, Hannah Gray was a formidable woman. She really put on certain committees for me that were absolutely perfect. They were perfect because they were ethical. And it wasn't like, we're going to get you. And I think that this is a really important thing to make sure that these kinds of things are really instituted in a way so you have fairness instead of, kind of autocracy. But I think people make their own choice about where they want to be.
Yeah, and I would just add that you can find allies in places that you might not even expect. And also, I've been in a situation now where we have, for instance, in our department, 5 people. We all specialize in treating breast cancer, and they've been a huge support to me. And when we need to make changes, we kind of throw the ideas around, and actually they have sometimes different ways of going about it that might be better than mine. So I think you have to be open to all different approaches, and that's been very helpful to me.
I just want to read one card and then go on because we have to finish this session in another couple of minutes, but this one is very emotionally charged, so I just wanted to read it. I am boiling, all caps, inside, because there has not been any discussion about organized or deliberate plans in place to address overt racism by faculty, patients, and colleagues. We need ongoing forums that discuss this and active plans to make a change.
And I hear that. I do think that there are things in place. There's lots of processes and procedures in place. You may not always know about them. There's lots of training that happens. There are conversations, dialogue, there's swim, there's more who are, you know, working together to address a lot of different issues, from mentoring to policy-related issues to other inequities that have been identified. So there are lots of things happening. Is it happening fast enough? Do we need more? Absolutely.
Let me just ask the last question. Can't we still be feminists and want to make a difference, but still look for solutions for work-life balance?
So I was just going to comment on the one of the quotes of Billie Jean King, who said, you know, her battle of the sexes and a lot of the things she did were not just about feminism, but sort of equalism and equality, meaning that everyone has a voice, everyone is equal. And I think if we go at from like more a global perspective, but understand each person's challenge, that's another way to be a feminist, but also give everybody opportunity and recognize everybody's struggle.
Yeah, Barbara.
I'd just like to say, having not been at Yale for quite a while, that I think this symposium has been a wonderful thing. The organizers have done a great job. And the fact that, you know, there's the person who wrote the note about the racism, you know, thank God this symposium's happening so that this can be aired. I mean, because I would imagine that there are many people that are completely shocked, you know, that somebody has felt so marginalized and so discriminated against in this institution. You know, it's shocking. And so I'm glad that this is an opportunity for the person to speak up and, you know, be heard.
Yeah.
So congratulations, Steve.
So thank you all for listening. We didn't discuss children or not having children, the pros, the cons, etc. And I am sorry if the Latino and Asian community felt left out of being represented on the panel. So we're just going to have to do the same thing next year or more frequently. And so thank you for your participation, and we're going to proceed right now to the next session. And thank you to all the panelists.